Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. Movements organized around disability justice, prison and police abolition, queer and trans feminism, and economic justice have long shown how intersecting systems of oppression require intersectional frameworks for resistance. My guest today on the show is Liat Ben-Moshe, who has spent her career tracing what she calls carceral ableism, or the ways that the prison industrial complex and anti-disability logics shape one another in our daily lives as well as political institutions. Her research and activism illustrate the vital need to foreground disability justice in our efforts to end violence. Liat points out that this kind of work produces a richer and more critical understanding of interdependency, one that neither romanticizes community nor enshrines individualism. In our conversation, Liat and I discuss how community building and mutual aid have shifted during the COVID-19 pandemic, and what that means for a post-pandemic future. We also discuss why learning to see one's identities as political rather than descriptive is so crucial for movement building, and why creating a world beyond containment, confinement, and segregation is how Liat imagines otherwise. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So one thing I've been talking with a lot of guests on this show about lately is how the pandemic has really pushed them to rethink the way that we form community, both professionally and personally. And obviously, the way that we collaborate with others has changed pretty dramatically over the past year and a half. What role do you find community playing in your projects these days? And how has the way that you connect with community shifted over the past year?
So I'm really glad that we're meeting around this theme of community because my work has really engaged with this theme for a really long time. So a lot of the work that I do is around deinstitutionalization and prison abolition. And the idea is not just about what to dismantle, but also what to build, right? Which is what Ruthie Wilson Gilmore always says. And by the idea, I mean the idea of abolition, the idea of deinstitutionalization. And so with regards to what to build, a lot of the answer has always been community. So whether we talk about community reentry, community corrections, community, different people talk about different things. And not that I think that those things I just mentioned are abolitionary, but the idea of community is really kind of thrown around a lot as the thing that is not the carceral or is not the institution. So community is definitely something I've been thinking a lot in terms of research. And one of the, issues is I think it's important also not to romanticize community. And I think that this is really clear for people who are queer, gender non-conforming, people who come from communities, people who are survivors of abuse, people who come from communities and even nuclear community, meaning, families of origins that were not embracing them, to say the least, right? Not to mention abusing them. And so I think it's really important as activists and as researchers, when we throw around the notion of we need to do it in community, is to also not romanticize what community is, but to really think critically around when we say community, what actually do we mean? Do we mean community of like-minded people? Do we mean communities of origin? Do we mean imagined communities, which is, of course, Benedict Anderson's definition of nationalism, right? Like, what kind of communities do we mean when we say that? So, that's kind of one thing I've been thinking of for many, many years, and I also have written a lot about that. But the second thing that I think is really important is the second part of your question, which is the way that might have shifted over the past year. And I think that, to me, I've been thinking more and more about what does one need in order to feel in community, right? And I'm thinking about that in relation to my own community, which is mostly like disability, anti-psychiatry, MAD, neurodivergent communities, and the way that people have responded to COVID, people have responded to abolitionary demands, anti-racist work, and all of that. So what does it mean to be in community, and who are the people that we're not kind of including in our communities? So it really brings the notion of political education to mind, because it's really important to note that disability and madness and neurodivergence are also political identities. Like you have to, even though that I identify as disabled, I didn't necessarily understood myself as disabled in a political sense, like that I have a community, right? That I have an origin story, that I have like a whole history of my community that I'm not aware of until much, much later in life. And so I'm thinking, who doesn't have that to understand that they are in community?
Mm. And that's complicated too, particularly when folks are new to social movements or new to, as you point out, the concept of an identity term as having a politics, right? As opposed to just being descriptive of a life or of an experience. And that's something that I think a lot of us who work in various movements wrestle with, right? Is like how to get new people in, how to explain that these things have histories, that they have politics to them.
Exactly. And I think in the case of disability and madness and neurodivergence, it's not just that people don't see disability, or that they might see disability as descriptive. A lot of people, basically everybody around us sees it as negative, right? So they see it as something that's pathological, something needs a fixing, a deficit. They don't necessarily see our existence is something that gives a particular ontology or epistemology, and so on. But I think that also understanding how that, identity, if you want to call it social location, how that connects to other social location is incredibly important, right? So it's not just to understand disability, but also how it connects to race and gender and nationality and, and so on and so on. So yeah, exactly what you are referring to.
Much of your work focuses on what you call carceral ableism, or the ways that the prison industrial complex and ableism and racism and sexism really shape one another, kind of rather than just being additive. They help define one another. They have historically, and they certainly do in our contemporary world. I'm thinking, for instance, of your book, Decarcerating Disability, which the Ideas on Fire team really loved working with you on the index, by the way.
You were all fabulous.
That book does a really amazing job of tracing, as you point out, the largest decarceration movement in U.S. history in the form of deinstitutionalization for people with disabilities. I'd love to turn to kind of your work in these fields and kind of pick your brain maybe a little bit about where you see the movements for prison abolition and disability justice going in the next decade or so, and what you think are some of the most urgent issues that these movements are tackling.
Yeah, that's such an important question. I hope I can do it justice. But I have to say, that I've been working on this book for probably over 10 years. When I first started this, there was hardly anybody in that intersection of disability justice and prison abolition. There always have been people that do the work like on the ground. But definitely in terms of scholarship, there was hardly anything. And even in terms of organizing, I found that if you go to kind of disability, particularly disability rights spaces, they don't have a good understanding of incarceration or decarceration. And if you go to prison abolition, they don't have a good assessment of disability or madness. So this was like a decade ago. That's totally different now. I find that there's a lot of collectives and movements and organizing that is happening either under the rubric of disability justice, under the rubric of anti-racism, or, racial justice, a lot of other formations that really embrace that intersection from a critical perspective. So, in regards to the first part of the question, I think it's already going, right? Like, I think it's already quite different than when I started writing this book. And, this might be interesting to listeners. I mean, it's a book I didn't actually want to write because I'm not from the US. I was born in the 70s. And I didn't experience this movement. I didn't of the institutionalization and prison abolition in the 70s. A lot of the book is about the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And I wasn't here. And I'm not, kind of an informant from these movements. And I was hoping that those people will write such a book and that then I could read it and use it. But over the years, I noticed that nobody has. And the more that I asked people to do it, they said, you should do it. And so I did. And that's where this book is coming from. And it's not that I'm not a part of these movements. I absolutely am. But my point is I'm writing a genealogy. And I'm writing a genealogy that I wasn't either alive for or I wasn't like here in the US for. And so that's how the book came to be. But in relation to the question about urgent issues that the movements are tackling or should be tackling now, I mean, I think there's several. One is, of course, now there's all these calls for defund the police, for example, that have come out from people who, I don't want to say got woke, but, got younger people that got really politicized because of the George Floyd murder and other police violence, police murders that have happened last summer of 2020. And of course, that belt was building on movements, Black Lives Matter and earlier movements, starting in the 70s, right? That really ended in this crucial moment that we're in, that things like defund the police or abolition are becoming kind of household names. But my worry is that now people are calling for, okay, let's defund the police. And instead people should call social workers, for example. Well, from, disability worlds and mad worlds, neurodivergent worlds, we know that calling social workers or psychiatrists or, these are people that are embedded in the system we're trying to fight. These are the people that take away our children, right? These are the people that, buy into this idea of biopsychiatry or the biological kind of basis of us being defective. These are the people that end up sending us to places that, okay, are not the prison, but are other sites of confinement in which we can't get out of. And so this is where I think we need to really embrace the intersection of disability justice and prison abolition, and to really think critically, not just of what we don't want, but also what we do want. Is calling social workers, something that bring into the umbrella of defund the police or abolition? Or is there a more capacious kind of vision that we want to have?
So speaking of a more capacious version, I would love to get your take on the question that I close out every episode with, which really gets at that version of a better world that you're working toward, not just what we're fighting, but what you're hoping to bring into being. So I will ask you this giant question that I think is also a really important question. What kind of world do you want?
Wow, that is a giant question. So obviously, my very specific fight is for a non-carceral world, which means not just abolishing particular places, but really abolishing the whole logic that we need to contain and confine and segregate people based on sometimes things that we think people quote unquote need, right? Like special education or segregated, units. And so I think that is like the small part of the world that I want. I mean, that is the slice that I'm fighting for. And it's not really a tiny slice, right? I mean, to kind of abolish whole carceral logics, I mean, you really need to abolish systems of oppression that construct these logics. So, but that is kind of the slice that I'm at. But, more than that, I'm kind of, right now we're in 2021. We're recording this in May. And this is the time, just to give, kind of like a time capsule for people who might be listening later on. At least in the US, this is when at least some people have already been vaccinated against COVID-19. And I'm thinking about your question about the world I want in a kind of transnational kind of way. I mean, it's so unequal, right? Like the distribution of vaccine is so unequal. Who has the ability to access, this kind of life-sustaining apparatuses is very unequal. And I'm also kind of thinking, and this is something I started to think only recently because of the availability of vaccines in the US, that people are starting to talk about going back to normal. And this brings me back to your question about the kind of world we want, because I think COVID has been absolutely horrific in a very, very unequal way. And I think the kind of people that are saying going back to normal are maybe people for whom normal made sense. And for the kind of population that I'm a part of and work with, it never made sense. Like that normal was awful. And the idea that because some people now have access to vaccines, we can kind of go back to some kind of, again, this super romantic version of how things used to be, even just a year ago, absolutely makes no sense to me and to the communities now I'm a part of. And so it's really, really important to really take stock of the moment that we're in which you're asking this question, because I do think it may be this kind of prefigurative moment, right, in which we need to kind of understand how we're going and what is the means to get there. And what is this year of staying at home has done to us. And again, going back to your question about community, for some people, the staying at home when the home is abusive has been horrific. But their ideas of going back to quote unquote normal or pre-pandemic, of course, doesn't make sense either. So I'm really kind of dreading this, in the literature, in criminology and otherwise we call it re-entry, right? Like I'm really dreading this moment of re-entry, both to myself and for others, if we're not going to be critical about it, if we're just going to quote unquote go back to normal. So this is the kind of world I don't want. I don't want the world of like 2019, the kind of global unequal world in which we're finding ourselves now. Like I said, with the distribution of vaccines, for example, you kind of see what capitalism and nationalism and other, was it Bush? It calls it excess of evil, right? Have kind of given to us. And I think that in the kind of shadows of that, came a different understanding of what it is that we need, the kind of mutual aid processes, the reliance on each other, interdependence, new relations with each other that came from this pandemic that I hope we keep and cultivate beyond the pandemic, if there is a beyond.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all these ways that you imagine and create otherwise.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad and myself, Cathy Hannabach. Audio editing was provided by the awesome folks at Pro Podcast Solutions. You can check out the show notes and transcript for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guests and find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.